Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if somebody asked this already, but do you provide study guides for the exams or the tests?
There have been a few exceptions to that. I quit putting out study guides back in 2008. For one thing, I got dismissed from Miller College for doing that. A lot of, so that, here's why colleges frown on it. It encourages students to not buy books, for one. But for another, but I do make one exception. Pass 1, there's a study guide for it on iCollege. So you will find a study guide for Pass 1. The passes count 11% of your total grade, 3 of them. You don't want to miss one. Otherwise, I don't. Because another reason, folks, history is reading. I want you to read. This is a good book you have here. I understand they've come out with a new edition that's later than this one. I was in the office today and never even bothered to ask about it. But they've come out with a new edition, which if you have, fine, I've got to get a hold of it myself. All right, anybody else have any other questions before we get started? Yes?
So the past one is separate.
Pass 1 is, yes, a separate, is 10 questions. They will be multiple choice questions. Now, the rest of the test will be fill-in-the-blank type questions. Where you'll see a word like this one in Merikar and Ayat, and you just simply define as best you can what or who in Merikar was. I've had a lot of students get close to 100, even 100% on this test. The pass, 50% of the students who take the pass wind up getting 100%. It's all, you know the difference between primary sources and secondary sources. Primary, written by a person who saw the event. Secondary, written by people who were not at the event, but who nevertheless read primary sources and wrote a history from persons who claimed to be an eyewitness to the event. Primary, secondary. That's Pass 1. I'll have more to say about Pass 2 later. Pass 2 is going to be a world map in which I ask you to identify certain places on the world map. All right. Anybody else? For my watch, it's time to start. In about 5 minutes, I'll call roll. Meantime, I want to direct your attention to something I downloaded and I actually uploaded to iCollege. I don't want you to just to read it really carefully. I want you to get the high points. I mean, several of you have raised your hand the other day that you've read the Epic of Gilgamesh, or Gilgamesh. This story is not generally put in the literature books, but to me it's important because, folks, it's about them. This apparently was a very important story at the time, entitled In Merikar and the Lord of Aratta. And Merikar was the second king of Uruk after the flood. Aratta, looks to me a lot like two things: at Mount Ararat, where the ark landed, or Harappa, one of the cities in the Indus Valley region of India, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. And anyway, Uruk went to war with Aratta. Featured highly in the story is about the goddess Inanna, who was part goddess and part human. And some scholars say that all of the world's major religions can be traced to this woman right here, be whatever she was, that she figured out or thought up a set of religious beliefs that in one form or another found its way into Greek and Roman mythologies, as well as Sumerian mythologies, Assyrian mythology, Egyptian mythology. All may have come from this woman right here. And I've been called opinionated, but to me, my own opinion, she was possibly one of the most evil persons who ever lived. Very, very much an evil woman. Lugalbanda, he was the next king after in Merikar. Now, in the story, Lugalbanda was part of Merikar's army, and he took sick, so they just abandoned him as a side in a cave. And he prayed to the gods, and the gods came, and he had a feast with them. But there's an interesting line in this, that he could sense that the evil just reeking from these gods of theirs, that somehow on some level the Sumerians knew that these gods were evil. Anyway, the gods gave him the gift of super speed, which he used to rejoin in Merikar's army. And when Merikar needed a messenger, he volunteered to be the messenger. You know, he kept his secret that he had super speed, and he went back from Errata to Uruk, again at super speed, engaged Queen Inanna and got advice. And then the little band went back and, with the advice of Inanna, enabled Americar to defeat Errata. Again, this story has the tone of pure mythology by modern standards. The people living at this time considered serious history. It contains a bit of history and a bit of magic or supernatural, which we find in every ancient body of literature, whether it be the Chinese, the Indian, even American Indian, the Jewish, every ethnic group, every nationality begins its history with a whole lot of stories that we today just simply, with our modern minds, do not believe. That we consider supernatural or consider to be far out or far-fetched at best. Gilgamesh, same thing. These, again, a lot of these people were demigods, part god and part human. Egypt. Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile. Egypt would be nothing more than an extension of the vast Sahara Desert, which is the world's largest, except right through the desert flows a big river, the Nile River. The Nile River doesn't start out, the Nile River starts out way down and deep in Africa at a place called Lake Victoria, and then the water flows to the north. Egypt's climate was very, very regular. You could predict it. There was seldom any rain. Now, all of a sudden, folk, within the last year, this has proven to be a little bit untrue. Egypt has been having rainstorms and floods, and Yemen, which doesn't have anything in the way of bad weather, has all of a sudden had two, what we might call hurricanes. They call them monsoons, but they've had two hurricanes in the last year or so. But Egypt once had very regular weather, and it was a highly predictable place. At a certain time of the year, the Nile River would rise up and flood the entire place and bring down a fresh layer of topsoil. That meant that the Egyptians were guaranteed fresh topsoil on which to plant their crops. And once the Nile River had subsided, they would plant. The Nile made trade a lot easier in it. The current of the Nile went north. The winds usually blowed south. That meant if they wanted to go north, they'd just simply put their sail down and their boat would float north. If you want to go south, spread their sail and the wind would blow their boat south. So boatmen could travel in both directions easily. They had abundant crops, and that made for prosperity. Now, folk, in my time, our professor was trying his best to make these civilizations look really, really old. But there is some evidence that Egyptian civilization just bang appeared all of a sudden. Within about 2 or 3 years, it was full blown with hundreds of people living in it, and just a sudden uprising. Again, a lot of what you believe will depend on your worldview. Egypt was divided into two parts. Now this is tricky. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Here's the trick. Lower Egypt was actually the north, and Upper Egypt was the south. Well, why was this? They didn't look at maps the way we do, with the map always pointed with north pointed away from you. Or you put a map on a wall, north is always up. They didn't see maps that way. They called this Upper Egypt because it was higher in elevation than Lower Egypt, which was lower in elevation. So the north was lower in elevation, so they called it Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt was higher in elevation. And the Nile River flows along for a while. Well, all the rivers in Africa, except the Congo, does this. Africa is located on, it's almost like it's terraced. A river will flow along for a while and then drop off. Flow along for a while and then drop off. These drop-offs are called cataracts. And anyway, to get around the cataract, they'd have to take the boat out of the water, drag it over the sand to the next low level, and then go on. And in other words, they just couldn't let their boat flow over a cataract, it would dash itself to pieces. And likewise, when they're going this way, they have to drag the boat around, get above the cataract a ways, and then put your boat back in the water. And again, this is true of most of the rivers in Africa. At one time, it's believed that Egypt consists of two parts, upper and lower. An ancient king united the two. King Menes is said to have united the two Egypts. And he is said to be the first king of the first dynasty. Now, the ancient world counted time based on the reign of their king. In the modern world, the Japanese do the same thing, still count time from the emperor. So in other words, if we were counting time the same way, this would be like in the 7th year of Barack Obama. But this is the way they'd keep time. Or if you say, well, Barack Obama is not really a king, so the nearest we have to a king is Queen Elizabeth. This is the 61st or 62nd year of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth has ruled for a long time and is on the verge of setting a record. The record is 64 years held by her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. But anyway, they kept time by their age of their king. Now, here is one of the catch-22s, though. We cannot accurately date any nation in the ancient world, with a possible exception. If you believe the Bible, if you believe the Bible's dating is right, then you can date the events in the ancient world. If you don't, it is known that the Egyptians deliberately distorted their own history to make their history appear older than it actually was. You might say, how could that be? Simply this: only a few of their scholars were trained in history, and the rest of the people did not know much about it. So they would, it is believed by some that they took kings who actually ruled at the same time and made it look like they ruled one after the other. Now, an example of this would be in our own country's history. In the United States, we had a period of time where we had two presidents. One of them named Abraham Lincoln, one of them named Jefferson Davis. Both were president for a period of about 4 years. If you decided that you don't want to admit that they were president at the same time and put one after the other, maybe put Abe Lincoln first and Jefferson Davis after Abe Lincoln, you could add 4 years to our country's history. Not would be right, but you can do it. Well, a lot of scholars believe the Egyptians did the same thing. They were trying to make it look like their kingdom of Egypt was the first one made by the gods, so it was the oldest. Today, we know it probably was not, but they were insistent that Egypt was the oldest. At the same time, Babylon was trying to insist that it was the oldest, and they were both probably outdone by the Sumerians and the people of the Indus Valley, which they would not admit to the existence of. The Egyptian king had a certain name called, wait a minute, yeah, okay, Pharaoh. That name made a lot of news last spring and summer, when for the first time in 40 years, a horse won the Triple Crown, and he was named Pharaoh, but they misspelled it. It's easy to do, folk. Huh? American Pharaoh, yeah. They misspelled it, and nobody caught it until after it had already been in print for several, and they couldn't change the spelling at that point. But anyway, Pharaoh was the name of the Egyptian king, and it's difficult for us now to tell which Pharaoh is which, particularly until late in its history, the Bible scholars did not name their pharaohs, not until about 600 BCE. So when you say Abraham visited Pharaoh, then Isaac visited Pharaoh, then Pharaoh promoted Joseph to be his prime minister, and then Pharaoh, we just can't, it's hard to tell which Pharaoh we're talking about. Now again, there are a lot of scholars working on this, and they think who these pharaohs were. And a big question always comes up, who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? And again, I've got an article here on my computer that has 4 different pharaohs who possibly could have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. Again, it's difficult, folk, and a lot of it's difficult. The difficulty is solely the fact that the Egyptians deliberately distorted their history. But we'll try to make as most out of it as we can. They had divided their history into 3 periods: the Old Kingdom, Middle, and New. Let me see. I'll just try that again. Between these kingdoms, between the Old and Middle, was the first intermediate. And then there was a second intermediate. And then they came the New Kingdom. Each of these kingdoms were divided into dynasties. Now, you're going to find out later the Chinese did the same thing, except the Chinese named their dynasties. The Egyptians just simply called it the first dynasty, the second dynasty, third dynasty, fourth dynasty. Then the Old Kingdom came to an end. Then came the 5th dynasty, the 6th dynasty. That was like the first intermediate period. Then the Middle Kingdom, 7th dynasty, 8th dynasty, and so on, 9th dynasty. Now, we are learning far more about these dynasties all the time. In fact, I have to tell you that when I was at UT, my professor admitted he knew very little about Egyptian history, and he didn't even teach it. So most of what I've learned about Egyptian history, I've learned on my own. Again, we could spend an entire semester, actually an entire school year, talking about ancient Egyptian history and go through all these dynasties and learn what each of them decided to do and who the main pharaohs were in each and how long each of them reigned, all this. But anyway, there is a very interesting pattern, folks, that I've told you to be looking for. One of the pharaohs built a canal that joined the Nile River to the Red Sea. I mean, today we have the Suez Canal that does that. And of course, you can see where this would be an advantage. I mean, that meant that the Greek world could get to the Arab world and vice versa. Joined the canal. Guess which dynasty he was part of, the Old or the Middle or the New? Who knows? That's it. I'm glad you said that. Not that it's right. It's what we think and the way we think. No, folk. The Pharaoh who built it was from the Old Dynasty. The point I want to make is the farther back in time you go, the more advanced they become. Now, our next question. The Great Pyramid. Was it built by a Pharaoh of the Old Dynasty, the Middle, or the New? Old. Later Egyptian pharaohs couldn't even keep the canal open. It's silted up. Part of it still exists today. I mean, it's part silted up and part, blown over by desert sands, but part of it is still there with a little bit of water in it. Yes, it was built early. The earlier pharaohs could build huge, huge pyramids. I mean, huge. Later pharaohs did not. Later pharaohs built temples, maybe magnificent temples, but nothing like the pyramids. The farther back we go, the more advanced they are. This is reverse of what we think of in modern times. I mean, the car I drove here in is far better than any car my dad ever had, because we know how to make them better than we once did. My dad had to replace tires every 3 or 4 months. I've had the tires on mine 16 months and counting. All 4 of them. Most of you are maybe young to know what I'm talking about. But, one time we had to replace the muffler on a car every 3 or 4 months. Today, mufflers last a lifetime of the car, 10, 15, and 20 years. Maybe every once in a while I have to replace one. Maybe one day. But anyway, our cars are better, our computers are better, our medicine is better. But in those days, the farther back in time they went, the better it got, and the people living then realized we are but shadows of what our ancestors were. We're just, we were not nearly as advanced as they were. Again, earlier pharaohs were more advanced. Now I want to elaborate a little bit on the pyramids. There have been, I mean, what you believe about the pyramids, folk, will depend a lot on your worldview. But the pyramids have made news since our last class, a week ago. Particularly the Great Pyramid, the biggest pyramid of all time is the Great Pyramid of Giza. And it made news in it. They think they may have found openings in it, rooms, hidden rooms that nobody has seen in thousands of years. We now have sonars and ways we can send waves into deep into the stones. And we're trying to measure the temperature, and the temperature comes out different. In other words, a pyramid, if it were solid, it would have a uniform temperature throughout the middle of it. Well, all of a sudden we're finding temperature variations of as much as 2 or 3 degrees, indicating that there must be some hollow places inside the Great Pyramid. And the next pyramid to it, there must be, how many of you happen to hear about this? Well, one of you might be about to raise your hand. But anyway, this is...
There probably was a lot of traps and everything down there before.
Well, one trap that went off when they went into the pyramid the first time in 100 years was a whole bunch of stones fell down and would have crushed them to death had they entered in by way of the door. See, what happened was there was a door, and somewhere over time the door got lost, so they burned their way in, you might say, by cracking the rocks with some hot fire, and made a passageway in, but then they heard a bunch of falling rocks, and later they learned that these rocks would have crushed them all if they'd have gone in by the door. But there might be trap doors, yes. To keep whatever they had in there super tight and super secret. For whatever reason, they want to keep it secret. All right, now again, folks, I'm going to have to. I'm not going to apologize for sounding far out. There are some reports that they have seen pictures among Egyptian drawings of what today resembles airplanes and helicopters. You can believe what you will about this stuff. Folk, you can look it up and then make up your mind to yourself what you believe about it. That did they have these things? Well, all right. Which brings to the next question I've already asked. Could we today build the Great Pyramid with our modern day machinery? There have been a lot of scholars who say that we simply could not. Our cranes would not lift the heavy stones, and would not, even 2 or 3 cranes combined together could not lift some of those 60-ton stones. We simply, then how did they do it? The best theory I've heard is they built it from the inside out. They didn't have a causeway. The causeway would have taken up more material than the pyramid itself. So they would build them from the inside and then raise up one level. They had ramps inside that have since been covered over. And they glide, the ramps were in what today is inside the pyramid. And they set the stones on the outside and then gradually go up from bottom to top. Yes?
Weren't the ancient Egyptians also doing like really complex, successful brain surgeries?
This has been told. I'm glad you brought that up. The Babylonians, then it's believed that their brain surgeries, their doctors were better than ours. This has been told. It was first told. I mean, I first saw it more than 40 years ago. Well, regrettably in a tabloid. And, I'm married to a journalist, and my wife doesn't hold much of a high opinion of tabloid news. Nevertheless, some of it might be so. Also, there are rumors that a lot of this stuff is deliberately covered up because modern man wants to think, hey, we're the top, we're the greatest, and no, we're actually an inferior image, greatly reduced in ability and greatly reduced in physical and mental powers from where our ancestors were. Yes?
Is it true, like, that pyramids were like little for the pharaoh, but like no one was supposed to enter except the pharaoh, or like his family or something?
We don't know. They were supposedly built for burial, but I have a book in my house, which I could bring, that says not one body has ever been found inside. That the pharaohs were actually buried in the Valley of the Kings, far to the west of the pyramids, in the valley, and they were not buried in the pyramid. Which brings me to something else. King Tut's tomb, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, supposedly has some hidden chambers that they have not been able to open yet. And again, you always have to be careful opening these things because they might be booby trapped.
So, like, what's the purpose of the pyramids? Are they just there to, like,
They were saying a lot that they worshipped a lot of the constellations and the sun and everything, so that they would like position.
They positioned the
point
three
towards
pyramids based on the
constellations
three
and sun.
stars of Orion's belt. And again, if you look up in the sky, you'll see Orion's belt. It's in the night sky. Of course, you can't see it tonight. Orion's three-star Orion belt, and then the Orion's belt is surrounded by other. The pyramids of Giza lined up with Orion's belt. And folks, there are really, really far out theories as to why they were built. They might have been large capacity to give them an unlimited supply of electricity. You might not know that if you take a couple of three coils or something together, like the old Tesla did, you can get free electrical voltage forever and ever and ever, supposedly. Nobody has really done it. Well, the Nikola Tesla lit up the state of Colorado. Now, the pyramids might have been energy collectors. They collected positive energy. There's all kinds of theories, and some of them are pretty far out.
It's hard to speculate too because they don't really know which pharaoh is responsible for which pyramid a lot of the time.
We don't. We have a guess that the Great Pyramid was built by Pharaoh Khufu,
Yeah.
and then the next one was built by his son Khephren. If Khufu built it in 20 years,
That's the problem, is that the timing doesn't work out right.
you'd had to put about 10, 15 blocks in place every second day and night.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's almost, by our method of counting, it's almost impossible. Yes?
I read somewhere that certain like Egyptian scholars won't even admit the actual date that the pyramids were created because it goes against like they're even older than religion, and that most religions believe that man is.
I'm going to be talking more about this. Inevitably, I mean, religious beliefs will eventually conflict with either history or science, and it's inevitable. Part of the reason, I think, is, I mean, I know I was told this class, science, when you come down to the theories behind it, knows absolutely nothing. So that may be why the theories are going to conflict. But one of the reasons, one of the reasons the Arabs fell so far behind Europeans was that the Arabs, they got to the point in studying their science where the science conflicted with theology and they abandoned science. Now, Europeans almost, I stayed after class for about 2 hours one Friday when I was talking to a young man. We talked to a young man, he was so upset that Christianity had hindered science. I said, no, wait a minute. Christianity tried to stop science, but it didn't. If you look at China, the Chinese philosophers completely stopped their scientific development. This is standard history for them. The Islamic clergy completely stopped their science. And both the China and India and Islam was once far ahead of Europe. But they couldn't stand it that their science seemed to conflict with theology. But I wanted to remind us about science, and I'll get to you. Many years ago, medicine was mostly herbs. Then we became more about, oh no, herbal medicine is primitive. Then we get more advanced still, and all of a sudden, we're taking herbs again.
Well, most pharmaceuticals are all deriven from the uploads anyway, so.
Well, whatever.
Technically, even the pharmaceuticals are still from herbs. They're just processed and packaged, so they don't look good.
Whatever. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is we go back and forth. Okay, yeah. Do you have another comment?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to rewind when you said like science knows absolutely nothing. I think that's a ridiculous statement.
Well, on a practical level, we have better cars, we have better gadgets, better computers. On a theoretical level, there's some major reason why every one of our theories
As a whole, yeah.
has a problem.
But I mean, there's some things that are like 100. Like if I drop this pencil, it's gonna fall down.
That's
You know what I
more
mean?
technology than science. But now, can you define what gravity actually is and why it works?
I mean, no, 'cause no one. I mean, the theory of gravity is very vague, and it doesn't actually explain like
It
the
doesn't.
gravitons
There's
and-
nobody has a real good theory to explain. They've had tried super strings, string theories, even hyperdimensional physics. That something goes on in another dimension we can't feel. You cannot explain gravity. I mean, yeah, granted, it's constant. It's a constant. Keeps us in our seat, keeps me on the floor. But holds the atmosphere to the earth. But now explain what it is. Explain electricity. I mean, explain it. If you can't do it, don't feel bad. I can't either. I mean, when I was younger, I'd read Einstein's theory that gravity is where that a body passes, creates a curve in space, and someday maybe I'll understand this. Now I think he was just simply putting a bunch of words together that he didn't understand what he was talking about. I don't either. If you want to read theory of gravity, Nikola Tesla put 100 words together to define gravity. If you can't, if I were to read them to you, you wouldn't understand them. I don't understand them either. You put 100 words together that suppose it was a highfalutin, high-sounding definition of theory of gravity. All right, so again, I'm going to stick by what I said. We don't have a theory that actually explains the universe. Several people have tried. We're still trying. Theory of everything, TOE. Someday we'll be able to explain every phenomenon in the universe, even though a lot of us have given up and saying there's some things that's just not going to be explained. All right, I better leave that. All right, how the pyramids were built and why, folk, much speculation. Yes, they do. All right. They do make news today. At one time, the capital of Egypt was at Memphis. The kings, the pharaohs, were looked on as being gods. The old kingdom gave way to the middle kingdom. The middle kingdom, they quit building pyramids, maybe because they didn't know how. They, during the middle kingdom, they built temples instead, built cities, built temples. They were great builders, like their ancestors, but what they built was really tiny compared to what their ancestors had. One of the pharaohs extended his empire to even include what is today Israel, or what they now call Palestine. Then came a period of extreme instability. It's called the Second Intermediate Period, when all of a sudden the Egyptian order broke down, and in came a group of people called the Hyksos. I've heard that word pronounced differently. Now, folk, I've heard an interesting theory about what caused this Second Intermediate Period. And it's found in the Bible, the 10 plagues that ultimately destroyed Pharaoh's army. And if you know anything at all about the story, Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea. And when Pharaoh no longer had an army, a bunch of barbarians called the Hyksos came in. Now, normally, Pharaoh's trained army could have taken care of the Hyksos in short order. But keep in mind, Pharaoh had no army anymore. So the Hyksos came in, and they took over, and they ruled Egypt for 200 years. Eventually, the Egyptians banded together and drove them out. But it's like they came from nowhere. Who were they? Probably just a bunch of desert Bedouins who saw an opportunity. They got the word, hey, there's no army in Egypt anymore. I mean, again, I've heard this theory. Anyway, the Second Intermediate Period is a period of turmoil. Eventually, the Second Intermediate Period gave way to a more stable period called the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom was to last, in effect, until the days of Cleopatra, when Rome finally conquered Egypt and the rule of the pharaohs came to an end. What we know about the Hyksos was they spoke a Semitic language, and they appear to have been shepherds, and the Egyptians hated shepherds. And one of the reasons might have been, if you know anything at all about farming, in land where sheep have grazed, when sheep graze grass, horses and cattle cannot graze that grass for a long time, because sheep have their teeth that stick almost out of their mouth, and they can get way down to where the horses and cows' thicker lips cannot graze once the sheep have been in it. So cattlemen oftentimes come into conflict with sheep herders, and horse grazers have often come into conflict with sheep because once the sheep have grazed the field, that field is good for nothing for several weeks. Anyway, the Egyptians apparently hated shepherd kings and hated shepherds in general, and a lot of your Semitic people are known to have been shepherds. Now, one of the kings of the Second Intermediate Period was a queen named Hatshepsut. There have been a few times, and this happened in China. There's a lot of parallel between Egypt's history and China's history. And in fact, that little chart I showed you shows the Chinese people originally coming from Egypt, which might, and to me, Chinese writing and Egyptian writing looks a lot alike, hieroglyphics.
Didn't we all come from Africa originally? Isn't that like where the human
Ultimately, I think they all started out in the Middle East, and then a group went to Egypt. But some of the people who were living in around the Egyptian and Canaanite area moved all the way to China. And this is what the charts tend to show. Anyway, Queen Hatshepsut, well, there have been a few times in history where a queen has taken over, and usually it happens when she's the wife of wife of the king. Her husband dies, and all she has is a young child. So they officially crown her young child to be the king, and then the queen steps in and serves as regent. Then oftentimes the queen will put her young child to the side and rule all by herself. Because the thing about a regent, once the king actually grows up, then the regent is pushed aside. Queen Hatshepsut did not kill her son, unlike some of the other queens who took over. But she took over and ran the place. And she took on the title of Pharaoh, just like the others. When she died, her son decided to try to obliterate her memory and threw all her statues in a trash pile. But if you know anything about Egyptian trash piles, in that dry, sandy desert, trash will last thousands of years. And we have recovered her statues. It made us believe that actually she was a very intelligent and maybe even a fine-looking woman. But again, it's hard to tell because these Egyptian pharaohs would oftentimes fake their statues also. We had an American president, the same thing. President Roosevelt, late in his life, did not want his photo taken. If you could visit his home in Warm Springs and look at one of the last photos that were taken of, you know why? He looks almost like the Walking Dead man. So he had an artist. When he died, he had an artist paint him. And the artist painted him looking young and healthy, when in actual reality he is an extremely sick man. And while he was posing with a painting, he killed her. The artist sent for a doctor. It was too late. Some of you might have heard that story. Yeah, but he would not allow his photo to be taken. Of course, also Roosevelt never allowed him to be seen in a wheelchair. And when he appeared on television, he was always shown from his waist up so that nobody could tell he was actually sitting down, but he appeared to be standing on the TV. Again, and nobody ever saw that the Secret Service would actually pick him up like a baby in his arm and move him from his car to the next car because he could not walk. All this, I mean, he was trying to make himself look stronger and healthier than he actually was. Well, the pharaohs are believed to have done the same thing, and some of them, judging by their mummies, may have been very, very sick, including King Tut. King Tut died in his 20s, young 20s, but he appears to have been a very, very sick young man. And we don't know why, for sure why this was, but
They're saying that his father and mother were sister and brother, and that had a lot to do with it.
I've read that, and I was about to say that, yes, that his father, he was inbred. Again, they believed, and the Spartans were to believe, so a lot of persons believed that we have the best genes in the world, therefore we can only marry within our own kind, within our own family, basically. And the result is, after a while, they produce a race of mentally and physically feeble persons. The Merovingian dynasty of France did this in the 300s, 400s, and 500s. And the result was their kings became weak and sickly. The Spartans did this, and the result was the Spartans tried to make a race of mighty warriors. Became extinct. I mean, if I go back to Sparta, I'll tell you how you make a race of super warriors. Send some of your men to Spain to collect a wife from there, and send some other of your men to Persia to collect a wife from there. Send a few more of your men deep in Africa, collect wives from there, and send others far away to Scandinavia, and come in and get all these genetic mix, and you'll produce a race of very super warriors, mighty strong warriors. I mean, I see at least one head nodding, but that was instead they tried to. Spartan men could only marry Spartan women. And after a few generations of that, the Spartan men became weak and ineffective as soldiers, and they finally gave up soldiering and took up acting. This, folk, you can research. But anyway, yeah, the inbreeding was a problem. King Tut, yeah, so we found his tomb, so we were filled with treasure. Somehow King Tut's tomb had never been violated thieves had taken away a lot of the treasure from the other pharaohs, but King Tut's had not. And we now are thinking that we have found evidence that there was another chamber in King Tut's tomb that we never have found. But we don't know if we want to go into it or not. All right. Now, Egypt's social structure, the upper classes consisted a lot of nobility. Yeah, they had a pharaoh. Under the pharaoh was the nobility, but you also had an interesting class of people that today's scholars would call priests, or sometimes call them scribes. Now, the word scribe means educated, means that they knew how to read and write, and of course they were the ones who kept their history. But some people believe that they actually should be considered scientists instead. That the pharaoh's priest, well, I want to remind you something, folks. In the ancient world, ancient man made no difference between science on the one hand and theology on the other. To them, science and theology were one and the same. They made no differentiate between politics, theology, and science. It was all one and the same. You would not see the Egyptian pharaoh who would say, now, on a personal note, I don't believe it is, but on a political side, I'll accept this. No, they only had one set of beliefs, and what they believed personally was their set of beliefs, whether it be religion, science, whatever. So these priests might have been their equivalent of science. And I want to remind you something you might not have heard. Sir Isaac Newton did not know the difference between science and magic. I mean, if you were to show him a device like this, he would insist it's magical. He didn't know the difference. I mean, to him, we in the modern world have discovered a whole lot of magic. Today, we would not, no, this is not magic, this is science, there's a difference, so he didn't see the difference. At the very bottom were the slaves. Now, eventually, the Egyptians all lost the land of Pharaoh. And if you believe the Bible story, it occurred during a big famine when they were forced to sell the land of Pharaoh to pay for the food that Pharaoh had stored up. Again, you can believe what you will, but eventually Pharaoh came to own all of the land of Egypt, except for a little bit to the reserve for the priest, or Zionist, whatever you call them. Egyptian religion was very polytheistic, very regular, very predictable, just like their weather, very regular, very predictable, very orderly. The king was considered, the pharaoh was considered God, which might explain why the pharaoh of the Exodus would not change his mind. They had a concept, and this is a foreign word, so I'm going to write it in cursive. The concept of Ka, which the best translation we have is soul. They believed that the Ka was a part of you that lived after death. So the Egyptians looked forward to a life after death. And one of the reasons, I believe they built they would send their pharaohs into the next life with a whole lot of gold and silver and food and statues of serve. Yes?
I just saw like a connection between like the Ka and Japanese culture. A lot of people believe like Shintoism, kami is what's considered the soul and things like that. So I just think it's interesting that like the two societies.
I've just said that I believe that some of the people from that part of the world migrated all the way to the Far East, and you can see the pattern. They left behind a trail of, you might say, a DNA trail. That some of them migrated all the way to China, and you find a lot of similar concepts and similar stories. Now, their chief goddess, and folk, when I first mentioned this in the year 2000, nobody in the class had even heard the word. I think probably every one of you had heard this word before. Isis was the name of their chief goddess. And according to the story, Isis had a son named Osiris, and Osiris died. And eventually Isis and Osiris traded places, a lot like the story of Inanna. And some people believe that Inanna and Isis were actually the same woman with different cultures. And when Isis was down in the netherworld, we had winter. When Isis came up to the top where we had summer, there was a trade-off between her and her son, where her son and she traded off where her son could live at least 6 months out of the year. That Isis' son Osiris was hacked to pieces. But Isis went around and collected all the pieces. There were 13 of them, and put all the pieces, put 12 of the pieces together. The 13th one she never found, but put the parts back together. There were other gods: Set, Ra, Aten, Anan, and a lot of the Egyptian pharaohs were named after these gods. The Isis cult, I mean, it's weird how that Isis has found its name in today's modern terrorist group. Is there a connection? That might be something that has to be determined. But there have been rumors going around that ISIS has been worshipped all the way down through history in secret societies and secret groups, both in the Christian world, in the world, the Jews, Judaic world, and in the Islamic world. Officially, no, they would never worship ISIS, but they get together in their secret meetings and worship a lot of these old gods and goddesses. You can take that for whatever you want to. There was a pharaoh who tried to change their religion back to monotheism. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaten. I'll write that down. As soon as he was gone, the next pharaoh undid everything he had done. I mean, we've had in my own lifetime, I'll go back to before most of you were around, President Johnson passed all this pork barrel legislation. President Nixon came along and undid most of it. Community action doesn't exist anymore. Again, Nixon did away with a lot of that. Job Corps, I think, might still exist, but not in the way it once did. So we have a history where that one ruler will try to do one thing, another ruler will try to come along afterwards and undo it. All right. The Egyptians were to gradually become weaker and weaker, and eventually they never did quite fade out of existence. Now, to jump ahead in the story a little bit, eventually they were conquered by first the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. Then they were conquered by the Persians. They were conquered by Alexander the Great. Then they were conquered by Rome. Then they were taken over by Islam. Basically, they became one of the weaker kingdoms of the world. And today, well, there are, all right, I'll just go ahead and say it. I mean, you can take it what you will. There are persons who have studied Bible prophecy and say that it's prophesied that someday Egypt will rise up above the nations and so become so strong. Egypt will think of conquering the world, but will not get far in that attempt. But will think they can conquer the world. The idea is not as fetched as it sounds, folks, because in the last couple of years we've seen a nation rise from the ashes and become fairly powerful. They've gotten the whole world against them, but if they could get, if some other group could come along, they could get the world on their side. Some of these Middle Eastern nations could become extremely powerful in a very, very short time. Be that as it may, folk. We'll be visiting Egypt a little bit from time to time in context with other countries. All right, moving on. Indo-Europeans. Again, depending on what you believe, a lot of the Indo-Europeans are said to have been descendants of Noah's son Japheth. They tended to start at the region of the Caucasian Mountains, which is why they get the name Caucasian. And from the Caucasian Mountains, which is, by the way, near Mount Ararat, they spread all over northern Europe. And then, for some reason, they began to migrate southward, possibly due to an ice age, or climate change. I mean, the climate focus throughout history bobbed up and down. And some of the Indo-Europeans went to India and became the Aryans. Some of them became the Medes went to Persia. The Aryans went to India. The Medes went to Persia. And then the Greeks settled, of course, in Greece. And the Latins settled in Rome. But about 1800 BCE, they began to move southward for whatever reason. But before they moved, they were great stone builders also. The most famous building they made was a Stonehenge. And folk, I mean, I have to come to modern times occasionally. The Stonehenge makes news regularly. I mean, if you look at it, yeah, the Stonehenge, they're finding out that there was another one, even bigger, that's been buried just a little bit to the south of him, where that the builders, where that might predate the one that we see that's still above ground. Now, where did the stones come from that made the Stonehenge? Well, from somewhere far away. Some people believe they came from Ireland. How did they move those big, heavy stones from Ireland to England? Nobody knows. Again, the ancient peoples appeared to have had a big knack for stone moving and stone building and making bigger stones than we can move today. No wooden ship could carry those stones across the ocean from Ireland to England. So what did they use to carry them across if they were quarried in Ireland? Well, if they weren't quarried in Ireland, I mean, if they were quarried in England even, the big question becomes how were they moved from where they were quarried to where they are now? And again, there's no good answer, folk. Now, I have a book at home that talks about 10,000 stone structures that Europeans made, and they all 10,000 have one thing in common. They've always been there throughout, ever since the records started, and nobody knows who made them. And they're made of stone. Those things they have in common. And it gives a location of each and what's been speculated as to when they might have been built, who might have been, what the legends say about them. But basically, they're houses like with the windows and a door, but no roof. The roof is long since decayed and rotted away. For a little bit, a body might could clean out the area and put a roof on, and maybe with doors and windows, and almost live in them. Problem with stone. Now, stone structures tend to crack and crumble and crack and crumble some more, and they do not last indefinitely. Today we make our buildings to where they can be easily disassembled and reassembled. When this building gets too old to be repaired anymore, they'll come in with a wrecking ball and tear it down, put another one in its place, and it can be done reasonably cheaply. All right. One of the more famous of the ancient Indo-Europeans was the Hittites. The Hittites lived in what is today Turkey. All right, the Bible mentions the Hittites a lot, and for many years, people would say, well, that shows the Bible's wrong because there were no group of people called the Hittites. Then we made a discovery that not only were they there, but they were a very, very powerful group. At one point, one of their kings, and no, I'm not going to write it down, but a king named Shupolulumus conquered Babylon and sacked the city, and it took Babylon 1,000 years to recover. This was shortly after the reign of Hammurabi. Babylon was attacked often and destroyed and rebuilt, and destroyed and rebuilt, and destroyed and rebuilt. But anyway, one Hittite king sacked Babylon. Eventually, though, as was a case of so many of these empires, the Hittites faded from existence and faded from the memory of mankind, and we forgot about them for 2,000 years. The Lydians moved in and they took over their territory, and the Hittites either mixed in with the Lydians or else they became extinct. Essentially, folk, you have a pattern that's going to be repeated throughout history. You have a civilization surrounded by barbaric people. The barbarians eventually outnumber the civilized people. The barbarians move in, take over, and the civilized people disappear from history and oftentimes disappear from memory. This happened among the American Indians time and time and time again. We're now beginning to discover they would have people we call civilized, and eventually the uncivilized obliterated the civilized, and eventually the whole North American continent, except for Mexico, became ruled by people we would call uncivilized. Anyway, the Hittites were the last of the major empires. The major empires were Babylon, Assyria, Sumer, Akkad. When these empires died, it was 500 years before they started to rise again. They began to rise with first Assyria rising again, then Babylon rising again, then Persia coming in and taking over, and finally Alexander the Great, and finally Rome. But for 500 years, there was no what we call world empire. really powerful empire after the Hittites. Now, another group of people, very interesting, are the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians lived on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. And if you look on a map of that part of the Mediterranean, it's very much like this. There are no good harbors, except for one. Right here near the place of Tyre, there is a little bit of what might resemble a harbor. Therefore, the Phoenicians settled along this harbor. And a harbor is very important because a harbor protects your ships that are at port from big waves and whatever. So the harbors are very important to trade. The Phoenicians were shipbuilders, and they traveled all over the Mediterranean. They founded the city of Carthage, which we'll talk about later. They also are credited with developing the phonetic, that's where the word phonetic comes from, phonetic alphabet. Where it consisted of a few letters, like 20-some letters, and each letter had its own unique sound. The Phoenicians taught their alphabet to the Greeks. The Greeks, in turn, taught the alphabet to the Latins, but the Latins changed it a bit. And most of the letters that we're using today come from the Latin alphabet, but the Latin alphabet was preceded by the Greek alphabet. Greek letters, I mean, they look somewhat like this. They're not quite like the modern letters that we use. But the Latin letters like this, and again, a lot of persons will say that, well, hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics had several thousand symbols, and each symbol represented a word. And if you think it would be difficult to learn, you're right, it was. Of course, the Chinese do the same thing today, and the Japanese and all the Far Eastern people have writing resemble hieroglyphics. Cuneiform was a lot the same way. There were a whole bunch of wedges, and each combination of wedges represented a syllable, not just a word, but a syllable. Well, the Phoenicians only had 20-some, maybe 22 or 24 letters to learn. And this made writing a whole lot easier and made it easier to learn. So the Phoenicians, again, they were traders. They gave us the alphabet that in different form is still used today. Where all did they travel? Folk, it depends on what you believe. There have been persons, there was a historian named Cyrus Gordon who believed that he would find Phoenician artifacts in South America, in the United States, as far away as the Philippines. Phoenicians are said to have traveled, some to have traveled all over the globe. A lot of persons do not believe it. You can believe what you want to. Excuse me. In addition to building Carthage, there was a city that's mentioned a lot in ancient literature, including the Bible, a city called Tarsus. Tarsus may have been located in what is today Spain, near the Rock of Gibraltar. Again, there are some ruins in that part of the world, but we don't know exactly where Tarsus was. Now, one Phoenician king, Hiram, helped Solomon build the temple of Solomon, the big temple of Solomon. Solomon became fast friends with Hiram, and Hiram, the Phoenician king, and Solomon got together, and Hiram loaned Solomon some of his best builders. And also, the Israelis and the Phoenicians got together, and every 3 years they'd go to a land called Ophir and collect gold. Now the big question is, where is Ophir? Nobody knows. Some people believe it's deep down in Africa, and some people believe that it's in South America. And yes, when we went to South America, we found gold there. So much gold that it alleviated all of Europe's gold shortage for hundreds of years. Where did that gold come from? Even the Indians did not know. All right. Leaving the Phoenicians for a while and then coming to a subject that, believe me, this next one I could easily spend a whole year on. I mean, starting in September and ending in May, 2 semesters. and a lot of persons spend their whole life studying it and teaching it, Israel. The Israelis claimed that they were descended from three men, Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob. And Jacob was given the name Israel. Jacob and Israel were the same person. Then that Jacob went to Egypt, and the Israelis were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And after 430 years, the Israelis escaped from slavery in Egypt, and they eventually settled in the land of Canaan and partially conquered Canaan. They never conquered all of it. They never conquered the southwest corner because the Philistines had that, and the Philistines were strong. But they were constantly at war with their neighbors. Again, I'm going really fast. Now, during the time that Israel was in Egypt, eventually a leader appeared named Moses. Moses was their lawgiver. Moses wrote a history of mankind from the beginning up until his day. And he wrote and then rewrote the history of the Israelis journeying through the desert, the wilderness. So they journeyed for 40 years in the desert, during which time they were given the law. And the law was a lot like Hammurabi's, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But it also might have copied some things from Egyptian law. Now, what I did not mention, the Egyptians had a book. The Egyptian people would memorize this book while alive, and supposedly when they died, they would be able to go and tell the gods that they had been very righteous. And the Egyptian they had 10 things, and again, this reminds of 10 commandments. 10 things with the law, and he'd say, and in fact, one of them was, I never moved my neighbor's landmark. Very important, because when a flood came and covered the land of Egypt, it's known a lot of Egyptians would simply go and find a big rock that was over the landmark and just nudge the landmark over there in their favor a little bit. Well, they would say, I never moved my neighbor's landmark. I am no adulterer. I never committed any murder. I never lied. I mean, they give 10 things that they had promised that they had not done. And it reminds us of Moses' 10 Commandments, that a lot of the things in the Book of the Dead. Supposedly, if the gods agreed that you had not done any of these things, the Egyptians believed that you were in for a happy afterlife. If you had done these things, you were not in for happy afterlife. Actually, there were some 600 laws that the Israelis were expected to observe. Anyway, after Moses died, Israel went in, partially conquered the land of Canaan, and tended to live in the mountainous hill country rather than in the valleys below. Now, as was the case of all ancient peoples, they justified their conquest. And here is one reason they gave for why they said that they were doing the right thing by conquering and displacing, and in some cases, folks, exterminating whole ethnic groups. The Canaanites were guilty of what a lot of ancient peoples were. They would practice temple prostitution. The babies who were born out of this prostitution were offered as a sacrifice to the gods in the ovens. We have still found the ovens, and inside the ovens are bones. Now, if this sounds gross, folk, it's in the records. But the Israelis believed that they would use this as a means where they could justify the driving out of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. And some people believe that the inhabitants of the land of Canaan who they drove out moved into Europe and became known as the Celts. The Celts were to haunt some Europeans later. And of course, yes, the Israelis also believed that living in the land of Canaan was a race of giants called Anakims. And the word Anakim looks like the word Anu, descended from Anu, the first of these gods supposedly who came to earth. Anu, Anakim. Again, this is all in the records. I don't know how many of you might have heard it told or not, but the giants, such as they were no match for trained and organized armies. These nations were able to get, the kings were able to get people together, soldiers, get them in a formation, And if trained the right way, they could even defeat an army of giants, because the giants could never organize themselves enough to fight in a formation, to fight as a team. One of the biggest enemies of Israel was the group called the Philistines. The Philistines are said to be the ancestors of the Palestinians who are living in Israel today. If that be the case, the war goes on. The war has gone on for 3,000 years and is still going on. Neither side has ever been able to bring a lasting peace with the other. At times the Philistines were to conquer and rule over Israel. At times Israel ruled over the Philistines. When Israel first came in, judges would take over. Now, these judges were persons who were, they were not hereditary. They were picked based on which one of them seemed to be the most powerful, the most charismatic ruler, the one who could command an army. So when one judge died, they would pick another man to be judge, and he would be judge until he died, and then they'd pick another man to be judge. One of the judges even was a woman. They would have constant fights with their neighbors, but then they would have periods of peace for a while. Then eventually, though, they set up a kingdom. The three of their first kings were, I'll tell you, I'm going to write the first now, but the two of the most famous kings were David and his son Solomon. Solomon was the one who built a temple with the help of the Phoenician king Hiram. Again, according to the story, as a youngster, David fought a giant named Goliath. Goliath was said to have been 6 cubits tall, which would have been anywhere from 9 to 12 feet, depending on the length of the cubit they used. David's kingdom went from the border of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River, extended quite large. Solomon built a magnificent temple. David and Solomon wrote a lot, and their writings are still around with us. When Solomon died, his son, as was a case of so many cases of these powerful kings, his son was not able to hold it together. The kingdom was divided. The northern kingdom was called Israel. The southern kingdom was called Judah. And Israel and Judah will remain apart for 300 years. Eventually, after 300 years, Israel was carried captive by Assyria. The kingdom of Judah lasted 100 years beyond that, and Judah was eventually carried captive by Nebuchadnezzar. I'll write that here. N-E-B. King of Babylon. Now, about the time some of you were being born, Nebuchadnezzar was making news. I mean, these people do make news from time to time. Saddam Hussein claimed that he was descended from Nebuchadnezzar, and he was an admirer, and he claimed that he looked like Nebuchadnezzar. Now, again, Nebuchadnezzar had this big, heavy beard, which Saddam Hussein didn't have, so it was difficult to tell if Saddam Hussein looked like Nebuchadnezzar or not. But Saddam Hussein was an admirer of two people and claimed to be descended both of Nebuchadnezzar and Saladin. Saladin was famous for having driven the Crusaders out of Israel, and Nebuchadnezzar famous for having conquered Judea and carried the people of Judea captive. Basically, these were people who had defeated the Jews or defeated the Christians, Saladin and Nebuchadnezzar. I'm afraid to ask for show of hands of how many of you even heard of Nebuchadnezzar, but I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on that. But he was one of the more famous kings in the Bible, by the way, mentioned in 2nd Chronicles, 2nd Kings, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Esther, among others, and especially Daniel. But anyway, that's all right. Now, late in their history, the history of both of these two peoples, late in the history of Israel and Judah, numerous prophets appeared among them. These prophets, I mean, some of the more famous were Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Ezekiel. These prophets warned them of the errors of their ways. You people are taking bribes. Your judges are perverting judgment. You are forsaking the law of Moses, and God's going to bring judgment on you for this. The message of these prophets was not heeded, but when it happened, what they foretold came to pass. They were looked on as being right, and they have been honored by the Jews to this day. Unfortunately, a lot of the prophets were killed because they gave a message that the people didn't like to hear. I mean, who wants to hear someone get up and say, this is what the Lord has said. Your young men are all going to be killed by the sword. Your wives are going to be raped, and your daughters are going to be carried captive to Babylon. Nobody wants to hear that. Nevertheless, this is what the prophets would tell. And it happened. Now, eventually, after spending a few years as captives in Babylon, a Persian king let them go loose, a Persian king named Cyrus. But folk, I believe about out of time, before I leave, I mean, we have one more class on this, and then the test Wednesday, class Monday. And I'll finish up Israel, and then go on to talking about the rest of Assyria and a few other places. But look, I mean, you can tell I'm pretty enamored with Israel. But does anybody have any comments or questions before we part? Okay, hopefully.